And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a returning good brother to the temple, coming to us from the world of Switchback Productions, previously on here for the multiple iterations of Voyager Tactics. Now coming back with a hybrid of Lancer and the Year Zero engine in Mancer. The one and only SYTO. How you doing today, man? Well, today for you.
Doing good. Glad to be back.
As my chiropractor often says, glad to see you're back. So, I suppose the first place that'll start is, what's the origin story when it comes to Mancer? Was it something that you had been kicking around for a while? Was it something that had a bit more recent of an origin?
So, I guess this was first motivated by me wanting to make like kind of magic school / magic task force type of story or setting. And there's been multiple iterations of this setting in different forms, mainly like in artwork and comics. And I always did want to make an RPG of it. How it arrived at Lancer and Year Zero specifically is a different story as well, but basically I did want to make one that was more tactically focused, just because that was sort of the wheelhouse that I wanted to go towards instead of making it more rules light. So a tactical mage game with spells and such.
I can get that, since the Year Zero isn't really tactically minded, even in something like Forbidden Lands.
Yeah.
And although when it comes to the whole idea of tactically minded, I think it's important to nail down definitions. So, what exactly do you mean by tactically minded? Mainly in terms of importance of placement and the like?
Yeah, so having tile-based movement, tile-based areas to calculate spell areas and such, mainly that sort of thing, and having builds so that you can sort of customize what sort of spells and loadouts that your Mancer has, and that sort of informs the world building and various cool things about the setting just by looking at what your choice of spells and different equipment says about your Mancer specifically.
Yeah, I can get that. And it also seems that you're going for a fantasy post-apocalypse. Not a post-apocalypse, post-apocalypse.
Yeah, I see. I seem to default to that setting a lot.
Well, it's a very underrated setting. I mean, there's plenty of post-apocalyptic games. Granted, most of them are more science fiction than fantasy, but post that is a concept that is a bit underrated. And for the sake of clarity, I will note that the difference between the two is how much time has been removed since the bomb dropped, even if it isn't a bomb. A post-apocalypse, it's a few years or a few decades, maybe even a century, like in some of the Fallout games. Post-apocalypse is where it's the bombs dropped, but it was so many years or generations ago that whole new cultures have sprung up.
Yeah, and I really like that just a sucker for the trope of having these sort of recontextualized lost technology or lost cultures that are basically like parallels to our own, and then seeing how it's like having fantasy within a very Earth-like world, while having a different culture to also compare it against.
Yeah, I could definitely see it. And if I were to use parallels, as much of a stretch as it may sound at first, I consider the world of Hyboria that you see in like Conan to be a post-apocalypse. Because one of the big hooks is the aftermath of the fall of Atlantis. If I have to use a more science fiction-y example, I would say, are you familiar with a project called the Genesis?
Yeah, I was about to mention that when you said Conan, actually, because it has that kind of same gritty aesthetic to it.
Yeah, but even though the bomb was the meteor that brought the Genesis and the burn to Earth, you don't really have the same Earth cultures or customs post the bomb dropping. You have whole new cultures and whole new cults, as they call it, that have sprung up. It's a similar principle.
Yeah, and it still has fantasy elements with all the weird spores and things as well.
Mm-hmm. It is kind of funny that you made a parallel with Conan with that, because I think Six More Vodka had said that one of their big influences was actually Tarzan. At least in the second iteration. The first edition of the Genesis, what's known as Primal Punk, was very messy in its look. It was not far removed from Mork Borg, with a system that I think even they would say wasn't very good. But
definitely very crunchy.
The original version, which was called Primal Punk. The version that everybody's gonna be more familiar with is known as Rebirth, and the original was using a more D10 based approach as opposed to the D6 pool. But I suppose one of the other things was, technically speaking, this isn't your first rodeo when it comes to building a game where there's an understood assumption that all the characters are some type of mage. Because you had previously done that with Our Spell is Steel, and I'm curious if there was some DNA that was carried over from that into Mancer, even though they're using completely different systems.
Yeah, quite a lot. It borrows the same kind of general aesthetic, and it's technically kind of the same setting as well, just sort of polished and tweaked here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, to people familiar with it, I sort of make the comparison to how, let's say, a game like World of Warcraft or even Dungeons and Dragons, sort of between editions, changes like certain details about its setting and how it works, but it still kind of looks familiar to anyone playing it. That's still the same kind of general franchise.
Yeah. Well, when D&D wants to pretend that it actually has a setting, until it doesn't. I will keep poking fun at the whole shit or get off the pot thing that D&D has had for the longest time about what sort of setting it has. Because
yeah,
even in its own editions, it's not consistent. And I can ask that question on social media and get a dozen answers, which is part of the problem. But now, given some of the more uh, unorthodox choices of races and archetypes that you have within Mancer, I'd like to play a little bit of word association. Consider this a return of the world's worst Rorschach test. So,
Okay.
I'm going to go through several of the races and several of the archetypes, and I'd like to get a feel for a character in any sort of fiction. Doesn't have to be within tabletop. It could be in video games. It could be in anime. It could be in manga. It could be in comic books. It could even be non-fantasy characters that would be a close parallel to the kind of energy you were trying to bring with that race or that archetype. Now,
All right.
obviously, human is getting skipped because that's kind of redundant.
Mm-hmm.
But depictions of elf have varied in form and function throughout multiple media. You know, sometimes you have them as the immortals, sometimes you have them as just another race, sometimes you have them with certain body advantages and disadvantages. What sort of characters were you trying to shoot for when it came to designing Mancer's version of elves?
I think definitely more anime leaning. So examples would be kind of like Frieren, or I think a close example might be how Dungeon Meshi has its elves, or Delicious in Dungeon in the West, where I think generally, just the idea of I think because it was during that season when Frieren and Dungeon Meshi were out around the same time that both of them, their main elf characters, which were Frieren and Marcel, both of them were depicted as actually shorter than humans, as opposed to the more Tolkien-esque elves, which were taller. And I actually kind of liked that idea for elves being actually shorter than and more slender than humans. And I think that just sort of became the catalyst for me making the elves.
Like how short is short? Are we talking like 5 foot range?
Yeah, not like halfling range, but short enough to be generally noticeable across
or 1.5 meters if I have to use the metric system.
Yeah.
I mean they're going to be short to me, but that's redundant because 90% of people are going to be short to me.
Yeah.
But then there's the Drakelings, the children of dragons as they're described.
Yes.
And given that they are human with serpentine or draconic traits, what sort of characters were you channeling with that race?
So I'm not sure if there's specific examples in mind, but the general concept behind them is sort of like these feral children, because they're kind of like raised by wolves or raised by monsters archetype, because most drakelings were kind of raised in the wild and have to live alongside dragons and other monsters, which makes them more, I guess you could say, feral or monstrous in nature and personality. So that's the kind of general archetype they are. Appearance-wise, if some of the viewers have played the game Arknights, which has a lot of these half-animal hybrid type characters, there are like certain characters, or rather a race in the Arknights world that has these characters with snake-like or crocodile features, like the main feature being like tails, for example, or sharp teeth, and it's just generally that kind of aesthetic. So it's not going full reptilian like say Dragonborn or Lizardman.
Would you say that the Aura in Final Fantasy XIV would make a good parallel?
Kind of. The aura actually the more close to the inspiration for for the Drakians in Voyager. That's actually their more close equivalent. Because the aura kind of have a somewhat more noble, regal aesthetic to them.
And obviously following that is the Fiendling, which the name itself kind of gives it away. But given the concept, what were some of the other kind of things you were trying to channel with that one?
Well, definitely, the Tiefling comes to mind, and just half demons in general, which are always popular, I believe, and along the lines of lore-wise, the Nephilim, which are like half angel, half human children in like biblical mythology, which mythology is like kind of one of the large gold mines of inspiration that took for creating Mancer's world.
Yeah, I can get that. Oh, since you brought up the Tieflings, I'd make more of a comparison with the way Tieflings were presented in 4th edition D&D more than 5th.
Which is?
Well, there's a lot that goes into it, but when Tieflings showed up in 4th edition, and that was their debut as a core race instead of a thing that was an expansion, they weren't necessarily descended from 8 unions of humans and demons. They were descendants of nobles who made pacts with demons generations ago. And said nobles were from an empire that had fallen into decadence a long time ago, and their descendants, while still having a bit of that nobility and spirit, had more of a look that would be closer to Romanese in terms of their style of dress. That and
so it was kind of more close to the aristocratic demon vibe.
Yeah, but the thing is, they don't have any power of nobles. It's more of they are the very, very distant descendants of noble families whose kingdoms had fallen on very hard times. Mostly because of the fact that they made deals with demons. But obviously the next one you have is the homunculus, which is another concept that there's been a whole lot of different interpretations of. So I'm curious what approach you were trying to go with the homunculus. What were you trying to channel?
So so the homunculus definitely one of the 2 artificial human races here, and they're definitely based off the idea of kind of like these sort of as if they're sculpted from like marble or clay, hence why the example illustration of the homunculus resembles the statue of David, the famous Michelangelo sculpture. And generally I wanted to have kind of this sort of marble statue aesthetic to them, but also um, this idea that they are created to be kind of perfect or aesthetically pleasing, which is why they have like this very kind of porcelain doll kind of look to them as well, which is another point of inspiration I took for them.
Nice. I suppose it wouldn't be too far removed to invoke the dolls that you see in the game Steel Rising. That's what immediately came to mind when you mentioned porcelain dolls.
I'll have to look it up.
And I will admit, when it comes to the last of the races, the white, what came to mind instantly was the likes of Alphonse Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist.
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of trope.
Yeah,
going forward there.
And there's plenty of characters who fall into that motif of the possessed armor or something like that. That's just the more obvious entry. Although the design itself, for whatever reason, makes me think of some of the early cast designs in Phantasy Star Online. I think it's because of the helmet. I see that, and I keep thinking of the Who cast design from that game. But
I see.
When it comes to archetype, which you mentioned as being the class, but it sounds like it's more of a package that leans into something rather than a class in the traditional sense. Given that, I'd like to revisit that whole analogy thing. So, what characters in fiction do you think would make a good fit for, say, the Magus, which is meant to be this jack of all trades kind of caster?
So the Magus is definitely like the default wizard archetype. So for anyone who kind of just wants to play like a mage right off the box, like something that you would expect in Harry Potter or any kind of typical caster intellectual type who studies magic, that would be the Magus.
What about sorcerer?
Sorcerer is kind of the unstable caster archetype, so what you would expect from, let's say, X-Men. You have like Scarlet Witch and Phoenix, for example, those who struggle to control their power.
Since you're bringing up Marvel, I suppose I could also bring up Black Bolt, one of the Inhumans.
Could be. I'm not too familiar with Black Bolt.
His whole thing is that he has insanely powerful sonic abilities, but it is directly tied to his voice. So 9 times out of 10, he does not talk.
I see, yeah.
To the point where he could wreck a city block with a whisper. So imagine if you get him actually screaming.
Yeah, that might count, I think.
And I could definitely see it. And when it comes to the Hierophant, is that meant to be more of the priest kind of archetype? I mean, it's kind of in the name, but...
Yeah, it's definitely the priest or cleric archetype. They also can be flavored as like a exorcist or a monk or any sort of kind of character focused on that sort of spiritual discipline or helping in service of others.
Yeah. And when it comes to psychic, that psychic has always been one of those tricky things to to manage in fantasy games. We did a whole episode talking about why it seems so hard for fantasy games to handle the idea of a psychic,
Mm-hmm.
excluding the ones that are just mages in all but name.
Yeah. So the psychic is actually more closer to a sci-fi concept, which is they're basically like a magic hacker
Mhm.
because uh, doing research on Mancer, like researching a lot of other systems before arriving at the ones I use, I was looking a lot into Cyberpunk Red simply because of I kind of like the aspects of the human augmentation uh, and I wanted to kind of have some slight sci-fi flavorings as well with the magic.
Mhm.
And I like the concept of the Netrunner. Obviously, if you've seen the Edge Runners anime, then
Mhm.
Lucy is kind of the more well-known example. And basically, the idea of someone who can kind of, sort of, in a way, astral project themselves into a different realm or a different state of being to sort of go around and collect intelligence or assault enemies through their mind, which is kind of what hacking does in Cyberpunk as well.
Mhm. Ah. So then there's the druid, which is another archetype that has had a lot of interpretation in terms of how it works. Um, in some cases, a bit too much. That's why Godzilla was a thing back in third edition.
Mhm.
But what sort of characters or what sort of leanings did you have with Mancer's interpretation of the druid?
So the druid here is more of kind of a cross between what you would expect from a D&D druid and a ranger. They're kind of the survivalist mage because obviously since the setting is a post apocalypse where there are pockets of civilization surrounded by a lot of hostile magical chaos.
Mhm.
Uh, so the druids are kind of specialists in that regard, where they thrive or even live directly off this untamed wilderness outside of civilization, and
Mhm.
so their actual abilities are more focused around mobility, navigating dangerous terrain, and generally that sort of mobility focused archetype.
Yeah. And when it comes to alchemy, as you call it, is more or less your setting's equivalent of the alchemist. Uh,
Yes.
what what would its approach be focus into?
So the alchemimer is kind of like an alchemist and kind of like a artificer as well. So
Mhm.
they are the item and invention focused archetype. So their abilities and backstory kind of revolves around creating things or repairing items. And I will add that the archetypes in general, just to explain to the viewers, that they are mainly for giving like a basic ability that informs your playstyle,
Mhm.
and as well as enhancing your starting attributes. But they also have mainly they kind of inform your role play by sort of helping define what is your specific place in the setting. And they are like uh, each archetype has a list of different potential roleplay details that you could use, such as your potential, which is kind of uh, like your main thing that you're known for, which you can evoke in game, and sort of what kind of struggles you may have, what kind of relationships or associates you may have that are common for that archetype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now the Ravener, I think that's the one archetype that's probably the most straightforward. It is for those who want to be the Gish, is the vibe I got from it.
Yeah, the Ravener is the fighter in a mage's world, but they still use magic. So, and the thing I did want to do with Mancer is I did want to make it so that all the Mancers in this setting can fight in melee, which you can observe in how their weapons work and all that. Even melee weapons can cast magic because they're made of special materials, but because I always loved the spell blade gish aesthetic, and I wanted to make a whole game based around that. But the Ravener is even more so focused into melee combat and that kind of warrior discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which does bring up something that I've talked about elsewhere, and why a lot of attempts to try and do anime or manga in something like D&D just don't sit right. When I look at a lot of pop culture media across East Asia and stuff inspired by stuff that came out of East Asia, one of the big things that I know that was very consistent no matter what country it was coming from is that the line between martial and magical is far more of a Western thing than an Eastern thing.
Yeah.
Like you look in say wuxia, and you don't have somebody who's a dedicated mage. What would be considered spell casting? You put that in a wuxia series, and it's just another form of kung fu.
Yeah.
You see plenty of characters throughout anime, throughout manga, throughout video games and the like, that are straddling the line between both.
Yeah, definitely martial arts and all that.
And when it comes to the final two, the Witch and the Mantler, from what I'm seeing, the Witch is for those who would often play a given game with some sort of familiar or some sort of buddy.
Yeah, it's the warlock summoner archetype.
The various pet classes that you'd see in a lot of MMOs.
Yeah, basically.
With the Mantler, was that meant to be akin to the that kind of gothic monster, like the old-fashioned werewolf or the like?
Yeah, so more classic influence would be like the shapeshifter werewolf type. A more modern example that also suits the Mantler is kind of like a symbiote character, so like Venom or Prototype. The Prototype games are also suitable.
Would you also throw in Claymore?
Claymore, I'm not too familiar. But Claymore, I'm not too familiar. But you can sort of, partially or entirely transform your body, which is why this sort of the Venom or Prototype comparisons are also suitable for it.
Now, as I understand it, when it comes to the whole thing of drawing upon both Lancer and Year Zero, when it comes to the tactical side of things and some of the way stats work, that's drawing upon Lancer. But the core mechanic is drawing upon the Year Zero system. I'm curious what made you want to go with the Year Zero system's particular brand of D6 pools for your core resolution mechanic.
So I was definitely searching around for I think it was mainly motivated by wanting a kind of base to use the template for the roleplay sections that was different from Lance's usual.
Mhm.
And looking around, I tested around a lot of different systems like World of Darkness or um, there were others. They don't come to mind right now, but uh, I think definitely Powered by the Apocalypse at some point as well. But I think I arrived at year 0 because it kind of had a decent middle ground of crunch or tactileness to its dice system, which wasn't too theater of the mind because it still tracked stats and items and such. And it was too discovering, like, the Mutant Year Zero and some of its and Forbidden Lands that all of them had this kind of post-apocalypse type vibe to the games that I thought would make it an easier transition into Mancer's setting as well.
And I can get that. Ah. And speaking of, it seems that one of the main things that you brought in from Lancer is treating the equipment setup, the regalia as you call it, as the settings equivalent to a mech, both in terms of the varieties of regalia and how you can customize them.
Yeah.
I know with one of the houses that you have, it's somewhat analogous to one of the corporations in Lancer. Is generally speaking, is that going to be the case with the other regalia types, where there's some parallels that could be drawn between the Lancer corporations and the different regalia in Mancer?
So definitely the houses in the Mancer setting, which are kind of the equivalent of like bloodlines or guilds, these sort of very powerful factions that essentially control the world, because this is a society that's ruled by mages and not by like kings per se. And an example I listed in the book itself is the vampire clans from Vampire the Masquerade, how each clan had his own aesthetic, its own sort of tenets, and its own kind of vibe, which kind of makes them familiar to people. And I wanted to make the houses here have this kind of place in the world where they are kind of the oppressive presence, in the sense that you're always relying on them for things, even if you don't necessarily want to, because the explanation to why magic is magic and your equipment is so packaged in such a way, like to sort of explain like how it's flavored, like the Mancer, the Lancer mechs sort of translated into magic spells and such, them being so modular, and the fact that you need to accumulate licenses in order to learn spells is because the houses kind of monopolized the learning of magic and monopolized all these sort of magical knowledge, equipment, materials, and it's only through doing missions for them, through appeasing them, that you eventually gain the permission or the sanctions, as they're called here, to learn more spells, to acquire more powerful equipment, and hopefully that can be a thing that players can play around with in their settings and their campaigns. The sort of tension that they may have with the houses, that how they sort of defined and limited what magic kind of is in this world.
Mm-hmm. And within Lancer, you had it where there was where each of the main corps, you had to go on these advancing licenses in order to unlock new mechs, new specialized weapons for those mechs, and so on. Uh, since the level setup that you have is the merit level, is that going to work in a similar manner where there are certain things you're going to be unlocking at certain merit when you're at certain merit levels, or do you have a different approach?
Yes. So merit level is basically like license level in Lancer,
Mm-hmm.
where as you gain each level, you can freely choose one of the licenses or sanctions from the different houses, which normally means, like in Lancer, you gain like small pieces of each regalia or mech, and you slowly sort of build towards it. First, you may gain like a weapon or a spell, and then at some point you get the actual regalia itself, which will sort of define your main playstyle. And yeah, progression wise, it is essentially the same as Lancer.
Yeah, and in that regard, would it be fair to say that that prestige perks are a more universal way of personalizing? There's not um specific prestige perks um for each regalia.
Yeah, so prestige perks are the equivalent of core bonuses in Lancer, which, to explain, is basically each company, each corporation in Lancer has core bonuses, which is you can treat it as it's like a kind of like a loyalty bonus whenever you keep uh, getting the same licenses from them or the same mechs, which sort of reward you with kind of passive or active bonuses that kind of enhance your playstyle with those mechs, but can apply to any mech that you play. So in the same vein, the prestige perks are sort of general buffs or passives that you can add to any regalia that you wear
Mm-hmm.
to sort of uh, augment your playstyle even more.
Yeah. Now, speaking of, when it comes to the standard weapons, I see that with some of them some of them have range, some of them have threat. Uh, what's the dividing line between the two?
So most weapons have a range which determine its attacking range as well as spell range. Um, and threat specifically is mainly for reaction attacks. So in Lancer, when you have a weapon with threat and an enemy, typically when they move away from you, then you may attack them using one of your reactions. So it's sort of the same thing here, where if the weapon listed has threat, uh, normally melee weapons in this case, then you are able to attack a moving enemy outside of your turn with it. So, and this is mainly found in melee weapons, which would incentivize you to carry one.
Mm-hmm. Which I can certainly get, and I definitely get a vibe that with how these spells are set up, that much like what you were doing with Voyager Tactics, they could be put in their own little cards. Uh, but shifting from that, what I also find interesting is the variety when it comes to the color setups, especially since several of them are using multiple colors.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious if there is a bit of DNA from card games like Magic the Gathering in terms of using that sort of color coding, or was there a different influence?
Let's see. I think it was probably informed from different influences everywhere, but I think generally it's just that I'm more of a visual oriented person.
Mm-hmm.
That I wanted kind of a way to navigate the book in and the different items in some way, and to sort of make it easier for the player as well.
Yeah.
Mainly through studying other RPG books and how they've laid out their abilities. So, uh, looking at definitely the more crunchy games. So, of course, a land surface headings and D&D 4E, Pathfinder, all these kind of games, and how they do use color to denote like what type of abilities they have.
Mm-hmm.
Another example is the Beacon RPG.
Mm-hmm.
Beacon also has color coded headings to denote certain types of abilities, and I sort of did the same here, but also adding icons to sort of more easily differentiate them, because even with different colors, it can be confusing to try to know which one does which. So the icons are also there to help
Yeah.
uh, tell the reader what exactly the thing is at first glance.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, uh, when it comes to the much like with the Lancer, it looks like when it comes to how characters are set up, it's one where you couldn't really look at one part of the thing to in isolation to determine how it's going to work. It's going to work through the combination. You know, the combination of your archetype, your particular regalia, and how you fill in that regalia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with that in mind, uh, I believe you have it set up that there isn't really a MP of equivalent of sorts, but there is an equivalent of what was heat in Lancer, but in what you have, it's strain. Basically, how far you can overpush it.
Yes. Which is the instead of your mech overheating, it's your Mancer, your mage, kind of taxing their internal magical power or their mind in order to perform a spell, which they can, which is when you use it on yourself. But strain can also be inflicted on you as a damage type through a mental assault, through various conditions and other non-physical forms of damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can get that. And I believe when I look at some of the other elements like sigils and rights. Rights, the way I saw it, it seemed to be very much akin to a stance. Since it's one that can be activated, and it stays as long as you want it, but you can only have one of them.
Yeah, it's the Lancer equivalent of a protocol, but it is basically like a mode or a state that you can toggle on and off.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to sigils, is sigils meant to be a kind of risk type resource for more powerful types of magic?
Yeah, sigils are the equivalent of, I guess, runes or kind of semi-consumable forms of magic that are not spells, but sort of like enchanted equipment that
Mhm.
you can activate to gain certain bonuses or to use a certain ability, which is kind of a way for you to maybe get the benefits of a spell or of a certain equipment without spending the resources to do those. So it's kind of a alternate avenue in case the player kind of wants to use their resources differently, and the player has to then make a roll to see how fast the sigil recharges, and it may recharge or may not at all. So it's sort of it could either be one-time use or see multiple uses within the same combat. And I think the main kind of vibe I think I wanted for the sigils are kind of like the signs in the Witcher games, where they're kind of like these single-used small burst spells that you can kind of use in a pinch, like the shielding Quen sign, or the fire one where it's just kind of like a use it and then it kind of enters like a cooldown of sorts. But it's basically like a very kind of on the fly sort of use of magic.
Which I can certainly get that. And within that, I know it wasn't in the core book, but when it comes to monsters and just the things that you'd find out in missions, do you plan in a future update to put in some sort of monster creation system, or even just adversary creation system if monster is too specific?
A bit early to say, but I definitely wanted to simplify the monster creation as much as possible. So they have simplified stats compared to players, only like kind of the necessary bits like the HP, and they don't have attributes or skills per se. They just kind of have a general modifier depending on what they're using it for. And then they have like a kind of suite of abilities that the GM can kind of take a glance and know that, okay, this is their default attack, this is their reaction in case this happens. So it's kind of very a lot of them are kind of triggered abilities or passives, and then one might be like a standard attack or more powerful attack. And it takes some inspiration from how Dragonbane designs its monsters with kind of like a single page breakdown of their abilities. Although in Dragonbane it's kind of randomly rolled, but here it's a bit more intentional.
Yeah. So I could see someone setting up some sort of random roll if they wanted to do a more hex crawly like approach, which, since you're venturing out into the less tamed areas, that's certainly something that can be leaned into.
Yeah, for sure.
But were there any concepts early on with Mancer that you had thought of, but had learned later on through development that it just wasn't going to work and had to get dropped?
I'm trying to see what comes to mind, because if anything, it actually became more complex than I originally thought, because at first I wasn't considering Lancer as a system. So before this, I was going to make Mancer into a custom system using its own rules, and that one had a more rules light approach to combat, to everything. So it's more close to what you would expect from Powered by the Apocalypse, where there's no dedicated tile based or grid based combat phase, but I think at some point, working on an original system kind of took too much of a toll, too much resources on my end, and I think I wanted to default to like what I did with Our Spell is Steel, and to sort of work my chops on refining or playing around with an existing system instead, which also has the added benefit of being able to cater to and consult existing players.
I can certainly get that. Now, I know you had just put up a update not too long ago for Mancer, but what would you be planning as far as future updates, as far as refinements or expansions into the text?
So we've recently hit our goal for the funding of Mancer, which is kind of like a mini campaign on itch.io where it's sold. And there, the main goal was to kind of have all of the base content ready, and that mainly means other regalia, because the regalia are kind of, like how it is in Lancer, where the mechs are the main kind of draw, the main marketing material of the game, to sort of draw people into thinking about what they want to play, their play style, what kind of cool mech they want to be. So Mancer also is kind of around those archetypes, but around what kind of mage I want to play as. So there are currently 2 in the beta test right now, and my aim is to have at least 8 ready for the full rulebook.
Yeah, I can certainly get that, since there's certainly a few that there's certainly room for a few, so that you don't have people playing too similar of characters to all that often.
Yeah.
But, and of course, I do appreciate that you have a character sheet that's fillable, because, well, that makes my job a hell of a lot easier. But with that said, I will look forward to seeing how Mancer develops, and how many times people end up calling it Lancer by accident. It's one letter off. Can you really blame people?
It is part of the reason why I chose Lancer as well.
Yeah. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here. And
no problem.
Anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
내 내 조심기 我们自由，我们自由。